Hello and welcome to this lesson on adding JPA support to a Spring Boot based project. As you might have read by now, JPA is Java Persistence API. It's a specification for all Java based ORMs. So JPA allows us to map Java classes to the tables in the relational database. And using this JPA, we will be able to perform persistence operations on Java objects. Now, before we can start mapping entities, the classes which are mapped to the relational database tables are called entity classes. Before we can do all the mapping, we should ensure that our project is set up with all the libraries needed to do JPA-based development. So let's see how we can use STS Eclipse to set up our project for doing JPA-based development. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, we already have our customer application. In that app, I'm going to right click on that pom.xml, and in STS Eclipse, I should have an option edit starters. So this will allow me to add libraries. So far, all the development that I have done, I have just used the very basic dependency injection features of Spring. Now I want to add JPA and MySQL database driver. Now I'm going to add JPA support. So if I just type JPA, you'll see we have an option to add Spring Data JPA. And I will also add MySQL driver. So this is the driver, JDBC driver to the database. So now once I add these two, so it may take several minutes if you're doing it for the first time to complete and get all the necessary jar files. So now if we inspect the pom.xml, we should see that it has added support for Spring Boot Starter Data JPA and MySQL Connect to Java. So you can as well, if you did not want to go through the GUI, you might as well copy paste these two dependency tags into your pom.xml and it would add the necessary dependencies. So this Spring Boot Starter Data JPA is going to get all the libraries, including Hibernate, to support JPA-based development. So Hibernate being the most popular implementation of JPA. Now, after adding this support for Spring Data JPA, let's see if we can run the application. So if I go to my main class and try to run the application, so you would see that when I try to run this main class, the Spring splash screen comes up and I get an error. So it complains about failed to configure data source, URL attribute is not specified, and so on. That is because we added Spring Data JPA support, it brought in a number of jars, including Hibernate and the Spring Boot Starter Data JPA jars. And as part of Spring's auto configuration, it tries to automatically configure all the necessary beans that are needed, the infrastructure beans that are needed to do JPA-based development. And one such infrastructure bean is data source, that is the connection pool. But it fails to do that because it has no idea where the database is, what driver to use, what is the username, password, what is the connection URL. None of that information is present. So we neither have the database nor have we informed Spring how to connect to the database. So let's fix this issue first. First, let's create a database in MySQL and create the necessary table to back up my domain layer class. I want a table to correspond to this customer class, and I want to eventually map this class to that particular table. So first, let me digress a little bit, go away from Eclipse and go to MySQL create the necessary database. So I can launch the MySQL command line client, and it prompts you for the password that you gave while installing MySQL. And while at MySQL prompt, I'm going to create a database. So I will execute the command create database followed by the name of the database. I will call it my database. And don't forget to terminate all commands, all SQL commands in this client with a semicolon. So now it says it created the database. I'll switch to using that database. I will use the command use my database. It switches over to using that database. So now that we have selected that as the current database, I'm going to execute the create table command, create a corresponding table. So I've already kept the create table command ready. I'm just going to paste it and it should create a table. Now I'll describe the table, describe customer. You can see in the customer table, I have customer ID, which is the primary key. It's auto incremented. Customer name, varchar, customer email, that's a varchar, and customer age, which is an integer. So I have all these columns. So these columns correspond to the fields of these columns correspond to the fields in customer class. Right, so what we have done is we have created the necessary database and the table. Now to configure, to let Spring know that this is the database and this is how you connect to it, we have a configuration file in Spring Boot based project. So if you expand src main resources, you would find a properties file called application.properties. This is a text-based configuration file of the format key equal to value. Spring Boot automatically at startup looks at this properties file to get to know about configuration entries. So there are a number of predefined configuration entries that you can do here. One such predefined or one bunch of such predefined configuration entries that we can do is related to data source configuration. So I'm going to supply this data source configuration spring dot data source dot URL equals the JDBC connection URL. So JDBC MySQL /localhost or the IP address the port number. MySQL runs at default port 3306 / the name of the database. In my case, it is my database. So this is the connection URL to connect to MySQL. Then we have another property spring dot data source dot driver class name. This will be com dot mysql dot cj dot jdbc dot driver. That's the name of the database driver to connect to MySQL database. Then I need to specify spring dot data source dot user name to be root and spring dot data source dot password to be whatever is your database password. So once we have set up this connectivity information in application.properties, we are ready to use JPA as part of our application. Let's test it out. Let's run this application again. So now this time it should run without complaining of any errors. You can see some pools got started, connection pool, and it is coming to that prompt. Right, so no errors. So our application is able to connect to the database. In the next lesson, we'll see how to do the actual mapping.